This is the Gravity Engine 2 overview of the ship multiple maneuver example in tutorials going further. So as with all of the examples, there's a GE2 documentation block and a link to documentation. And in this case, the documentation is really a crucial part of this scene because there are quite a lot of moving parts. And what I'll do in this video is give you an overview of it, but to really get through all the details, the documentation is going to be a useful asset. So what we have here in the scene, I've got it on play maximize. We'll just go ahead and show you what it does. We have a ship that's the player ship, and then a kind of an NPC ship, and we have a maneuver panel that allows us to click add. And that pauses the scene, and we can now do a sequence of manual maneuvers, which is a very classic thing to do in a ship space game. So this point here is the maneuver point, and we can move that along the orbit if we want to. So we'll just put it there, and then at that point we can make a velocity change. So what I'm doing is adding velocity along the track, which is going to raise our orbit. And then if I want to do a further maneuver, I can click add again. I get another maneuver point. And this time, instead of specifying its position as a percentage of the period, I'm just going to go ahead and pick apoapsis, the furthest away point. So that's where the maneuver is going to happen. And then I can, again, change its track. And I could also, in this case, change its inclination a little bit. If we use our arrow keys, you can see that I've now changed the inclination of that orbit. And then if I want to commit to that particular sequence of maneuvers, I can click execute, and the controller will go ahead and push those maneuvers into Gravity Engine. And not only that, but as it goes along, there will be callbacks to clean up the view of the segments as the ship progresses through them. So it's a pretty full-featured scene. There's a lot of good stuff going on. So we can press 4, speed things up a little, gets to the final maneuver, and around it goes. So we can stop that. Now there's a ship maneuver controller, and it's broken into two pieces. One is the canvas, which is the thing that manages the panel and the sliders and all of that stuff. And then there's the maneuver controller itself, which has an API called by the canvas. So if you want to put your own API onto this, it's nicely partitioned in that way. What's happening with the, if we look at the controller, the GS display star ship, currently the ship was evolving under gravity mode. That's fine. We could also, if we wanted to, take advantage of another feature in Gravity Engine where we, instead of putting in maneuvers, we put in segments of conics for each branch. So if we wanted to reconfigure the scene to do that, we would switch this to Kepler mode. And then down at the bottom here, we would click patched. Now we can move the time forward and back as long as every object in the scene is using some kind of deterministic propagator. So we need to look at the NPC ship. It's set to Kepler, that's deterministic. We could look at the star. It's set to fixed, that's very deterministic. So then hiding in this canvas for just this purpose is a slider, which we can turn to enabled. So that will be represented as a time slider, and you can see down here it has this GE time slider script on it. So what this lets us do, if we press play, again we maximize, just do a couple of quick maneuvers here to give the feel. And so now if we execute, instead of pressing fast forward, I can just drag this slider and move forward to the point, and you'll see that the orbit changes as we jump from the different conics in the segment. We can go all the way to the end of it and end up in our final orbit, and then backtrack if we want to. One thing that the scene hasn't done is re-enable the orbit segment display as you go backwards in time, and that's just to keep the code a little cleaner so that it's a little easy to follow. We'll pause there. There's also a new component being used. Excuse me. This ship maneuver controller takes advantage of a prefab for each of the markers so there's this maneuver marker prefab. And if we look at that prefab in more detail, we can see that it not only has a GS display orbit, it has a component we haven't talked about yet called GS display orbit segment. That's described in more detail in the online documentation, but the basic idea is it's like an orbit display, but you can specify a from and a to point, and that's how we get the arcs to show the partial maneuvers as the scene is evolving. So that's a useful little component to know about. The way the controller code works, it'll turn on the orbit display for the final maneuver, so you can see the final orbit that you're in, and you can have segments for all of the maneuvers before that. All right, that concludes the overview of what this scene does. There's a fairly in-depth description citing the various parts of code online that show you in more detail exactly how this is done. Thanks.